Австралийг Welcome. Сайн байцгаана уу хүнд үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр ороо манай дефакто нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Азийн Хөгжлийн банкны Монголын захирал ноён Робэрт Шоэллхаммэр оролцож байна.
Роберт Шоэллхаммэр Зүүн Английн их сургуулиас Хөгжлийн эдийн засгийн бакалавр, Абирдийний их сургуулийн Хөдөө ажуйн магистрийн зэргийг тус хүртсэн. 1992-оос 1994 онд Schoellhammer одооны Удирдлагын Академид Англи эдийн засгийн багшаар ажиллаж байсан ба энэ хугацаанд Монголын хамгийн анхны бизнесийн магистрийн ангийг байгуулж 1992 онд орон нутаг дахь ядуурлын тухай томоохон судалгааг хийжээ. Роберт 1995-аас 1997 онд Украины засгийн газар Батлан болох яамны Европын комиссийн зөвлөх 1997-оос 2000 онд Африкийн Хөгжлийн банкнд боловсролын салбар хариуцсан эдийн засгчаар ажиллан 2000 онд Азийн Хөгжлийн банкны зүүн Төв Ази хариуцсан хилтэст төслийн эдийн засгчаар ажиллаж эхэлсэн. 2003 оноос түүнийг стратеги бодлого боловсруулах хилтэст томилсон бөгөөд энэ хугацаанд Шоэллхаммэр Азийн Хөгжлийн банкны ерөнхийлөгчийн удирдлагад ор банкны Аз намхан далайн бүсийн үйл ажиллагааны бизнес төлөвлөгөөг удирдах байсан. Тэрээр 2007 оноос Азийн Хөгжлийн банкны Хойд Америкийн суурин төлөөлөгчийн газрын дэд захирлаар 2011 оноос Азийн Хөгжлийн банкны Монгол дахь суурин төлөөлөгчөөр томилогдсон ажиллаж байна.
Good evening.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for having me on your show.
How many years are you already in the country?
Well, it's gone so fast, which I suppose means I've been enjoying it, but 3 years this time around. But also I worked in Mongolia in the early 90s, from 92 to 94. So it's 5 years in total. It's almost like a second home, you might say.
92, 94 is just the beginning of ADB Mongolia Corporation.
Yes, that's right. Although at the time I had a different function. I was working as a lecturer in the old, it was then called the Institute of Administration and Management Development. Now it's the Academy of Management. So that was my first introduction to Mongolia.
Please tell us briefly to our audience about ADB. What is that? When was it founded? What is the difference with the World Bank, etc.?
Well, the ADB was founded in the 1960s. So we've been around for close to 50 years now. And the countries of ADB are really the countries of Asia and the Pacific. And if you look back to the 60s, Asia was in those days generally a very poor region, a region which was very short on capital.
After the Korean War.
Yes. And it's nowadays, if you're looking from Washington or London, Asia is, of course, the center of the global economy. It's been the home to fast growth and investment, multinational corporations. Investment is now coming from Asia to the rest of the world.
Yes.
But in the 60s, when ADB was founded, then Asia was quite poor.
Yes.
And the thought was that Asia needs a specialized institution which will serve its countries, which will bring investment, which will bring capital, and which will bring knowledge.
And you did.
That mission, yes, and that mission hasn't changed.
And every Asian country can be an ADB member if they want. And they are members probably.
Well, we have a total of 67 members, including, I think, most Asian countries. And but it's quite an international community in that we have members from North America, from Europe, and if somebody wrote a book about ADB one time saying the bank to half the world, because half of the world's population lives in Asia. So ADB's mandate is to support its member countries. And I think what's very important, I would say the special focus of ADB is to be a specialist in Asia. It's to look at not just global solutions, but to find out what works best for its members in the Asian context. And so to this date, I think we've been delighted, of course, to see that Asia has progressed so much. And we've been delighted to have helped our member countries to have progressed.
Your institution is almost from the beginning of our democratic changes. We became a member at a very hard time for our economy. And there were several cases where you have been really helping. How do you see the major achievements you have done in Mongolia?
We started operations here after Mongolia invited ADB to come in. The first projects were very simple, practical projects. They included aviation, the renovation of the old Boyantocha airport. That was one of the first ADB projects. At the time, so many planes would fly over Mongolia, over Mongolian airspace, and they wouldn't pay anything because there was no tracking system. And under an ADB project early on, we supported the navigational aids. I believe now Mongolia gets $90 million a year in revenues from flights which pass overseas.
19.
No, 90.
90.
90. And this comes back to that project which, at the time, it cost far less than the revenue which has been generated. We also worked on, you might remember in the early 90s, it's ironic to think about it now, but I remember there were evacuation plans for Ulaanbaatar in case the power stations ran out of coal. Oh. There was a shortage of coal in those days. And in this very cold city, if the power stations, heat and power stations ran out of coal, you'd have a disaster.
Do we have still that plan?
I think it's always good to be prudent.
Okay, all right.
But so there was that urgent need for heat. So we actually helped work on the rehabilitation of combined heat and power plant number 3. Just given the enormous expense, we couldn't focus on a complete new heat and power station, but at the time it was a rehabilitation. And one of the other areas we worked on was telecoms. In the early 90s, I remember traveling to some rural slums. Even at the IMAG level, it was sometimes difficult to phone back to Ulaanbaatar.
Yes.
And I remember I had to
You would ask somebody to connect it, wait for another couple hours.
That's right, yes.
Place.
Yeah. It was quite, I always quite enjoyed it. You went into the post office, you booked it. People were always very helpful. But you had to go and book a call in the post office. So Mongolia had fallen behind on the telecom side, so we helped a lot on telecoms. And maybe the assistance is quite old and it's not that well known. But some of these groundbreaking investments, I think, we're very happy with. They made a contribution. Plus, we worked in education and health.
There are many social projects you have been working with Mongolia, System Mongolia. Altogether, how much money you have, or do you invest, or how you, or you just give as a grant altogether? Do you have any figure on that?
Well, totally. In the first 2 decades, we were primarily a grant provider, because at the it's not that interesting for an outside observer, I think. But in ADB, we have 3 different categories of countries, and the category A, in which Mongolia found itself, there you can only receive grants and concessional loans, and it's quite limited. We were limited to about, on average, it ranged between $50 to $70 million a year, which sounds small in today's Mongolia, where the talk is of mega projects and so forth. But in those days, it was rather large.
It was big money. Yeah.
Yes, and so we had to be very selective in deciding where to invest. But the money itself at the time was 50% grant, most of it, and 50% a concessional loan.
Concessional loan meaning that for long term,
yes,
a very, very cheapest possible interest rate.
Yes,
which is about 2-3.
No, it was less actually. It was under this so-called Asian Development Fund, which we used. The interest rate was fixed at 1%.
Wow.
With a repayment period of 40 years.
Wow.
And there was a grace period of typically 8 years.
Wow.
So no payments became due until 8 years after the loan kicked in. So some of these loans are now being repaid back. And even though they were cheap, they are nevertheless loans. And Mongolia's had an outstanding repayment record, which has been very, very impressive. And it is a foreign exchange loan, and but that's why we've always tried to invest in projects which make a difference to people's lives and generate a social or economic return. Because these loans in particular, they can bring a lot of potential, but there is a cost. So we always have to be very careful.
Many countries Welcome. in the world. I mean, some countries have difficulty to pay back some loans, like you have described it. But however, to my best knowledge, ADB had created a sort of result-based management, really checking not only the country pays the loan, but this loan made a really impact on the way the people live.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's a highly important point, because ultimately I think about 2 weeks ago, I went to Edinet, and together with the IMAG government and also our counterpart in the Ministry of Construction and Urban Development, we opened up a waterworks which brought clean water sanitation to 50,000 people in the Gare area of Edinet. So for me, what's most important there, yes, we work with Mongolia, but ultimately what we want to see is that just ordinary residents of towns and cities across Mongolia and outside of those towns as well, we see them as our clients, whether it be from education services or water or sanitation. We work with government, we work with the private sector, but ultimately the client is exactly the person who we hope will now enjoy clean water. So it's very important to keep that focus, whom we work for, because now in Mongolia, we moved Mongolia to a new category. So unfortunately, we can't provide grants, but this is because Mongolia has a higher creditworthiness and a higher income. So everything we do now is on a lending basis. They're very low-cost loans, but nevertheless, they will have to be paid back. It will be taxpayers' money.
The terms, how long, compared to the previous concessional loan? What is the difference now?
Well, it's a bit more expensive in that the interest rate has gone up to 2%, and it's repayable over 25 years, with a grace period of 5 years. So it's still much lower than one would get on the capital
way lower
markets.
than the market. Well, that your trip to Abirdийний and what you have described about the water supply, for example, to Gare area in there, brings us to the concept that the country is discussing. Now everybody speaks actually about this inclusive growth. Please tell us about the concept and where does it come from, please.
Well, I think ADB actually had a major hand in the origination of this particular term, because it's one of the huge issues of Asia. Whichever way you look, you will find multiple definitions and multiple interpretations. But ultimately, it's one of those things which you know if you are included or not as a person. Again, it's very important not to. Of course, we have to understand it academically and theoretically, but again, it goes back to the ordinary resident of any one of our member countries, for example. Are they benefiting from growth? And if you look at the experience of Asia Pacific, it's famous. My last assignment, I was the deputy head of our North American office. And from OECD countries nowadays, Asia is looked on generally as a continent which has arrived, which is a major global economic center and a competitor to the established OECD countries. But despite the growth, despite a huge outpouring of people from poverty, which is fantastic, a lot of people do get left behind. And they get left behind in the terms of they don't benefit from clean air. In Manila, where ADB is housed, some of the biggest struggles in Manila, our host city for Asian Development Bank as a whole, growth doesn't mean anything to the ordinary person, including myself when I lived there, if you can't breathe the air, or if the water is not drinkable, or if your child cannot go to a kindergarten or a school. So I think it's very important to look at it from the perspective of just from normal people. If the economy is growing, in Mongolia, for example, you know extremely well, has been one of the fastest growing countries in the world, 17% growth. It's been amazing. But growth itself, it's something to, yes, to
in particular
applaud.
When you have a high inflation?
Yes, a lot of that growth. High inflation brings with it high growth brings with it high inflation, which we know from around the world hurts people like pensioners very much if you're on a fixed income, and it drives the prices up for people who are maybe low earners. So growth in itself is something to aim for, but it's not the only thing. We have to look at, and particularly in the Mongolian context, where so much focus was on mining. Well, mining is something which we believe can succeed and will succeed in Mongolia, but no nation can build its economy on one industrial sector only.
Understand.
So the diversification is really critical.
And this inclusive, you have also a project for that.
Yes, that's right.
What is that project about?
Well, this inclusive growth project, we received actually grant funding from the Japanese government to support this. And I must say we've had very strong interest with from really across the spectrum in Mongolia, including the government and academia, the private sector. And we've brought in actually a very reputable think tank, actually from the United Kingdom, Adam Smith International, to really work out what does that mean in the Mongolian context, and how can policymakers and decision makers react to make sure that we are achieving inclusive growth.
So that Adam Smith International, that think tank is what they are implementing the project, or they are creating awareness of the project among the people and among the government, or they are doing a particular projects including everybody. What is that project about?
It's a combination really of many of those. One of the things that we're looking to them to suggest for ADB's own program, which is currently, if you take into account both the private and the government operations, we're lending about $250 million a year into Mongolia. So we also want to know directly from them, how should we invest? What investments will make the biggest difference? And as we discussed, we're not interested so much in that growth figure. The type of thing we're looking at is how many jobs will be created? Are we making sure that pensioners or people with disabilities are able to benefit from the greater opportunities that the growth brings? And I mean, as you'll know very well, there are many different interpretations, but ultimately what we would like this company to do is advise us, but also advise decision makers in government, in parliament. What are the right decisions to be made to make sure that everybody benefits from growth?
And have you been identified where to, provided this is a mining economy, the commodity price ups and downs, cyclical, and then where is that something that keeps people not that vulnerable to these changes, and yet inclusive? Have you identified a particular sector or project that you will continue in that regard?
Well, 2 weeks ago I was in Manila, actually. We had a meeting with our board to talk about exactly this. And their main question was, how will ADB support inclusive growth in Mongolia? My response at the time, actually, when asked, was, I mean, first of all, this is a concept which is actually quite strong already in Mongolia. If you look at, if you compare Mongolia to many other Asian countries, Mongolians can be very proud of their record in many fields. We have, for example, a social protection index, which compares let's say, the effectiveness, the coverage of social protection systems. Mongolia ranks third in all of Asia, after Japan and South Korea. And this is actually, it's a very impressive system as set up.
Social resilience, in a sense. Yes,
and we see here a real commitment as well to education. If you look at the education indicators, literacy rates are among the highest in Asia. Primary education is, despite big demographic movements, a lot of people moving to UB, it's the indicators are actually very good, and again among the highest in Asia. The Millennium Development Goals, which are, as you know, are the global benchmark for assessing development progress.
So the Millennium Development Goal is something that the whole countries around the world have agreed to reach certain goals within this millennium that started 2000, right?
Absolutely.
Now we have 14 years past. So within this millennium or 1,000 years we have. So in that regard, back to the project, what particular achievements? How do you measure this inclusiveness? Will you be measuring, or have you been creating the measurement now? How do you see?
Well, I remember in the early 1990s, there was a recession in Europe. And I remember the biggest problem that many students had who were graduating at the time, like me, was finding a job. You were educated, you had high aspirations, you had high hopes, but finding a job was a very difficult prospect. So for me, that's one very, very critical aspect. Are people, especially young people, given the chance for decent employment? A good, rewarding job which will allow them to live a decent life. So the jobs is for ADB, this is something that we will be stressing very much more. And this again comes back to why the need for economic diversification. The mining brought in very welcome foreign investment, I think. It brought in high growth.
Yes.
But it's a capital intensive industry.
Yes.
And I think the latest figure is 4% of the labor force works in mining.
Only, yes.
Yes. And I've traveled now in Mongolia to 18 out of 21 IMAGs. And what you see is that when you move away from cities or from the mining sites, for many people in Mongolia, their life itself is still very much related to agriculture, livestock in particular.
Yes.
And actually, I quite envy them. It's a glorious, it's sort of those glorious landscapes. And in Europe, we spend all our lives fighting, working for a little parcel of land. Mongolians are so rich.
Keep moving.
Mongolians are so incredibly
but
rich.
They don't.
Land
we
unlimited.
Don't appreciate it completely.
And I see that it's and if a definition of wealth is the amount of land that you have available, then Mongolians are very rich indeed. And
so back to the jobs issue. Before we go to the Mongolian jobs issue concern, can I ask, was it difficult to find a job? You are half German, half British, and then you have done school in the university in the UK, and then you end up at the end in Asia. How did it happen, please?
Well, my first job actually, I was studying in Scotland. I was doing my master's degree in agriculture, and at the time it was the time of a huge history, of course, around 1990. And when I was graduating, it was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I was very curious, of course, because there was this whole world opening up. And so I took a job in Dresden, in East Germany, actually working on employment programs.
You're speaking also German?
Yes, yes. And I think that's how I was, that was my first job, working in Dresden, working on these re-employment programs. And that's actually where I had...
Former democratic Germany.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we became familiar what was remaining of the center of the planned economy.
Absolutely, and it was an enormously educational experience. Because although I grew up mostly in Africa, I grew up very much in a Western context, international schools, and so as a Cold War child, I had very much grown up with, I think, Western thoughts and Western values and Western culture. And so to find myself living on that other side, that mysterious, elusive side, was a huge revelation, I thought. And it was actually my first contact with Mongolia of any type, because there were a lot of Mongolians who lived in Dresden and who had studied there.
So Mongolia is your destiny. You spent a lot of years. Concerning, you are one of the high-ranking officials in ADB, being a country director, right? Out of the 67 countries. What does it take to take that position? You just don't jump it. It is worth of a lot of work. What was the most important for you, the feature or character important for you to have these positions?
Well, I think the main thing in the ADB context, because it is an Asian institution and it's an institution set up really to serve its member countries, it's to have a record of, I think it's a commitment above all. Commitment that this is not a 9-to-5 job. It's commitment, commitment to really deliver in terms of results. It's it's working for one of these international institutions is actually a great privilege, because we're able to work with a great range of countries on projects of great responsibility, and we have that trust. We have to have that trust from the countries which join, and they pay to join ADB. Mongolia and other countries pay to buy shares in ADB, which is how the institution is funded. Mm-hmm. So our member countries, but also our donor countries, they entrust us to invest money with the expectation that we we do projects which make a difference.
So on one hand, Mongolia is a member, and also on the side of decision, on the management side. On one hand,
yes.
On the other hand, as any other developing country, they receive certain grants and certain. And 20 years from now, how do you see ADB in Mongolia?
I think Mongolia, in 20 years' time, we would very much, of course, like to see Mongolia, I think a little bit, it'll be sad, of course, but we would like to see Mongolia graduate. This has to be our ultimate goal for all of our member countries.
As a recipient of loan?
Yes, and hopefully even becoming a donor.
Well, in that sense, being a donor means we will be contributing towards development of other, maybe Latin American countries.
Or of other Asian countries, yes.
Okay. You see, you know the country, we keep saying that we are doing this political and economic transitions at the same time. Unlike our neighbor countries, many Asian countries who had long tradition of democracy before, but economically not very much successfully, not every country, of course. In that sense, what is, you think, lessons of this parallel transition in terms of Mongolia?
Well, there are many similar lessons from many other Asian countries, where, again, if you go back to the early 90s, a lot of the focus, including by ADB, was to stabilize the situation. Mongolia had a low GDP, $400 per head GDP. I remember the budget was something like $150 million when I arrived. And now it's a pittance compared to what we see nowadays.
Almost $5 billion.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a huge change. But at that time, the focus was very much keep the heat and power stations running. Those high human development indicators, as an educated population with a strong cultural base, how to preserve that. So Mongolia obviously has achieved that growth at $4,000 per head. It's there in the ranks of middle income countries. But very often, as we've seen in many other countries, as countries grow, people do get left behind. And the issue which I'm particularly concerned about in Mongolia, but it's something we see in many other countries as well, is on the environment as well. As countries grow, environments get degraded. And it's not a theoretical concept. If environments get degraded, people can't breathe the air. They get sick because of the water. If grasslands don't get enough, if they get overgrazed, you have desertification. So I think where we need to really focus more is on the environmental side, that green side of development.
Today, in particular in Ulaanbaatar city, remember there is I think British fairy tale about the grasshopper and ant. Remember, the grasshopper was jumping all summer, the other was working hard. Then in winter they knocked the door, it's cold, freezing, give me in. They said, no, what you have been doing? The ant was asking, the grasshopper said, what? I was singing all summer. And then the other said, okay, then you keep dancing all the winter. Ulaanbaatar is like this. We tend to forget about our smoke in summer, and we start to speak about when cold is coming, air is becoming more dirty. And it keeps going on like this. And our politicians promise tons of things, and it keeps staying. How do you see the solution?
Well, again, I think the focus is environment is not an add-on. In everybody, if we go on the concept of inclusive growth, the basics need to be sorted out People need air to breathe. They need food. They need water. Those are the very, very basics: housing, shelter, and it needs to start from that foundation. There's no point in having a sort of a full bank account if the air will poison you. You'll only be spending the money that you have on expensive air purifiers and locking yourself in. And we see too many polluted cities in Asia, where
the number one is here.
Yeah, it's I think in many counts, Ulaanbaatar is among the highest. But there are so many others that I've visited, whether it's in Beijing or Manila or Jakarta, and where again, if you're wealthier, it's okay. You can leave town. You have an out-of-town
That's what
residence.
Some guys do.
Yes, but not everybody has that luxury.
Yeah.
So this is inclusive growth in practice. Can you run away? Can you afford that very nice Panasonic air purifier, or do you and your children have to inhale toxic air? So this is this is such a core part of that inclusive growth. As we grow, don't just look at that GDP figure. Look at the environment in which people live, and there are opportunities within that. But in the case of Ulaanbaatar, we know this is a very high priority, and there have been many donor projects in the sector focused very much on replacing stoves. But nevertheless, even if you only get 30-40% efficiency gain, you really need a very big structural shift. And part of the solution has to be, again, get out of the short-term thinking, start investing long-term.
Housing?
Housing. Modern housing with, for example, with a more modern form of heating. You know, as you know, we're working on a new heat and power station, which will be run by a global consortium, which will be much cleaner. There are new options nowadays. You can use solar power for thermal heating.
Yes.
But ultimately, one needs to invest. So people who are currently living without a proper source of heat, they need to be living in more modern accommodation.
So when the power station number 5, for which finally the agreement was signed last week, also last month, when it is working, it will be looking completely different than the power station number 4, I understand, and the air will be more, the smoke will be more clean, and it will be more guaranteed or ensured supplying heating and energy both. And ADB is working with that project, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Which part of the project?
Well, we actually have 3 roles, and we were really delighted to see the concession agreement being signed, because ultimately, and because this project is done as a public-private partnership, it means that the capital costs will not be borne by the Mongolian budget and therefore the Mongolian taxpayer. Instead, the financing that the lenders would provide, and possibly ADB, would be directly to this global consortium of blue chip companies who will bring the highest standards of technology and knowledge to this one. But our job has been also working as the advisor to the government to bring this very critical project through. And in addition, we're also providing support for the infrastructure, which could be distribution, transmission networks, and so forth.
Distribution will be in private hand, or which part will be in private hand?
The private hand in
production will be there by this concession agreement.
Yes.
The companies will operate it, and later on will give back to the government.
Yes, after 25 years.
After 25 years. And the distribution, there is certain infrastructure to be made new one.
Yes, and this will be the on ADB's side. Our discussions are to provide financing to the government, for the government to put into place that infrastructure.
Well, I wish they do on time.
It's the thing I think to celebrate on this project is one of the world's largest, if not the largest, energy sector public-private partnership is happening here in Mongolia.
Well, and that's great news.
Yeah, and we have we're delighted that we've played a part in this one, and of course, again we also. This is not the time to sit and rest, and but
it is
now's the
beginning.
time. Now's the time to move.
Yep.
And ultimately, when in ADB, we're going to celebrate when the power plant switches on, and people can actually benefit from that heat. And you mentioned housing. We actually helped get the mortgage system running. We had a housing finance project here, I think about 11 years ago, and that brought in the first mortgages. So we have to also help people get into good, clean, modern housing, energy efficient. But a broader thing, and this is where ADB will be focusing a lot. Traveling around the country, you see the great potential that I see here, and ADB sees, is agriculture. You have Mongolians have 17 head of livestock per person, and in Northeast Asia, there's a vast demand for food. Now, this is a commodity which people will always need and always want. And Mongolia, as a clean producer of organic food, will find great markets in the Northeast Asian region, not least in China, where the demand for lamb, demand for beef, milk, there's huge potential.
And yet we are buying milk from abroad.
Yes,
today.
There's
very paradoxical, isn't it?
It's very paradoxical, and it's something which is not affordable. Why spend foreign currency on importing milk when there are so many cows? And we actually helped. We've helped some dairy companies here. We worked with. We visited just recently VitaFit, which is an ADB supported company, and they're setting up a dairy farm, Mongolian cows. Living in the most glorious environment that cows anywhere in the world would want to live in.
Enjoy.
Yes, and of course we know there's infrastructure needs to be developed, skills need to be developed, finance needs to be able to come to these companies. But then ultimately, as an exporter to the Northeast Asian region, we see vast potential. And most importantly, this will create jobs.
That's a great vision. That's, I think, a good alternative to mining, and I hope we will move to that end, and with the help of ADB and under your leadership. And I think this project will bring soon substantial impact on the way Mongolians live. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.